is keen to encourage others and embrace their talent, especially young women. I've seen her do that. She's also an ace feminist and a great friend to women in media in Victoria and Tasmania. So thank you for joining us, Rachel.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for the invitation. And thank you. We're going to be thanking each other. It's lovely to be here on International Women's Day.
Good. Now, I introduced you as a feminist, but I haven't actually checked with you. Are you comfortable with being called a feminist? And what does it actually mean to you?
I am comfortable with being called a feminist. I've been called a feminist, actually called a feminist when I started doing stand-up, from the time I started doing stand-up. I'm very comfortable with it. I think of it as more an active role. I think politically, that the original 60s statement of the personal is the political really resonates for me. But I guess where it manifests for me is in my work. There's mostly in my work, there's there's a saying that when a male comic gets up on stage, people listen and then look. And when a female comic gets on stage, they look and then listen. And I have found that to be true. And so I think the minute you get up on stage and you are not dancing, singing, being cabaret artists, doing the sort of things that traditionally women have done on stage as far as being artists on stage, when you're talking and doing exactly the sort of things that people even now are more used to men doing, it automatically makes you a feminist, because you have to be able to, well, for me, I relate to everybody equally. I always make a point of being able to communicate to everybody in the room. It's equally. I'm not one of those comedians or female comedians that works to the women in the room only. I don't think that's a good thing. I don't think that moves us forward.
No. And do you slag off men and women equally?
I do. I don't. I do, but I don't. It's not that I slag. Well, I do. Yes, because it depends on the person. I mean, I used to get into trouble if I slagged off a female politician, because other women say, no, well, you shouldn't do that. But if they've done something, gender is irrelevant to me. To me, that's feminism. If it's going to be equal, somebody has a bad job and there's an opportunity for me to ridicule them, which is what my gig is, then I don't care about the gender. I'm not going to apologise because of gender. Yeah.
Cool. Now, what about International Women's Day in that case? Is it still relevant now that we're meeting on International Women's Day? A lot of people are just like, oh, it's all pink cupcakes and,
Look, I wish we didn't have to have it, to be honest. I really wish we didn't have to have it, because it means that we've still got challenges and we've still got a long way to move forward. And I think particularly I've been reading that during COVID, things haven't really gotten worse, except the bad things have been more exposed. More women have lost jobs because those sort of jobs that were lost because of COVID, hospitality and other jobs, and in fact frontline workers, that they weren't lost jobs, but there were more women in those jobs. So women have really been affected by COVID. I know that domestic violence has gone up globally, and so I think at the moment it's not any more relevant. It's just relevant in a different way. And I think whatever way you celebrate it, if you want to celebrate it with a bunch of girlfriends and having picked cupcakes, then celebrate it that way. If it's women getting together and it means that they can share something, I don't have a problem with that. I'm not judgmental about whether, you're having a conversation about more women in politics or you're licking the icing off a cupcake. It's I don't judge that. I mean, I didn't really know much about feminism until I started doing stand-up, and then suddenly I was on the front line, and I had very political girlfriends who handed me books and said, read this, read that, read this, read that. And it was very useful. It was extremely useful, because I hadn't really thought about what it would mean to get up on stage in 1986 with material that wasn't necessarily gender specific. There was still a lot of women doing material that was sort of gender specific. Women didn't really start doing stand-up or working alone, writing their own material until the mid to late 60s. Prior to that, most women were characters. often the material was written for them by men, or they were the sidekick, you know, the comedian, the sidekick to the male performer. And so it took a long time for women to actually write their own. I mean, there had been burlesque artists, and there had been people, of course, like Mae West, who had always written her own material. But interestingly enough, Mae West was a brilliant writer, brilliant performer. And yet for years, people kept saying she was a man because a woman couldn't be that funny and that, you know, sort of sharp. And in fact, a lot of her writing is so misquoted. It's, you know, everybody knows that line from whatever that cowboy movie and that Mae West was in. She comes down the stairs and she says, come up and see me sometime. You know that line? Most people would know that line. Come up and see me sometime. The actual whole line is, come up and see me sometime. Come on Wednesday. That's amateur night. She was an absolutely brilliant writer. So she wrote her own material, but was still never really, you know, was always as a sidekick to a male. So really when women started writing their own material, being really political, was really at the beginning of the first wave of feminism. And they were angry. So a lot of the material was very angry. And although the 80s were 20 years later, there were still women, and for a start anyway, a lot of women were talking about things that, even if they weren't angry about having children, you know, about birth, about partnerships, relationships, in a way that people hadn't heard women speaking about before.
Yeah. And what got you into it then? Was it anger, or when did you actually start stand up, in the 80s?
I started stand up in 1986. I mean, I was always interested in humour. My parents were Holocaust survivors, and they were very damaged and very broken, but they both had, they each had a really good sense of humour. And I remember one of my earliest memories really is, and it clearly had a huge impact. I remember sort of feeling that my parents were very tense. You know, at even the age of 4 and 5, they would just stress people. And but when they laughed, there was a visceral difference in the room. It was palpable. So I didn't really understand the joke. I didn't really understand what they said, you know, being really little, but I could feel that there was a difference in the air. And so for me, laughter was always good. But we immigrated from Israel to Australia, so English is like my third language. There was Hebrew, Polish, and then English. So when we came here, my English was very bad. I was very shy, an immigrant child at a time when, you know, there weren't as many resources as there are now. And so I wasn't a show off, I didn't perform, but I was very interested in laughter and jokes. So I would listen, my parents had a couple of comedy albums, and I would pick up the needle when it was an album, a record, and I was absolutely, this is really revealing something, what an OCD person I am. I was absolutely mesmerized by the point at which the audience started laughing. I didn't care about the joke so much, but this is at 8, 9, and 10. I'd pick up the needle and I'd put it back to the point where the audience started laughing. And I'd do that again and again and again and again to try to work out why they laughed. I don't know why I did that. Maybe I was a very lonely, sad child, but I think it probably impacted on my timing later on. But I was, you know, and I still today feel the thing that's driven me for now 35 years is because laughter is very potent. It's the most potent way of communicating, because if you think about when you laugh, if somebody says something funny, you laugh and then you think. You don't think and then laugh. So in that gap, actually in your brain, that little moment between the laugh and the thought, you can make profound change. Because at that moment, people they're not only not judgmental, but there's that tiny moment. And also, if you think about what an audience looks like, when you see people laughing, their necks are exposed, their heads are thrown back, they're really relaxed and open, they're very available, they trust the comedian. And so, it is a way of not manipulating people, but at least making little suggestions to them. The very fact that a woman can be on stage and talk about all kinds of topics, I think already for men of a certain age who aren't used to seeing women doing that, they're only used to seeing women dancing, stripping, singing, acting. I think that of itself is quite powerful.
Yeah. Did you meet any resistance from, I've heard of people having trouble getting their first gigs, or always getting put off for other men to start with, or being told women aren't funny, all that sort of stuff. Did you find that sort of backlash,
I actually had, look, when I started at a place called The Last Laugh in Melbourne, and it was incredibly supportive. The men and the women, the comedians that were already working, Jen Kitson, Wendy Harmer, Gina Riley, there were a lot of fantastic women that we all know today that had started a few years before me or around the same time, and men. They were incredibly supportive. The audience wasn't necessarily, in fact, because you often get asked, did the men make it harder for you? But they actually didn't. They were very supportive. In fact, I had one instance, one occasion, there was a sort of a hierarchy in the way you worked. So you started off by doing 4 minutes or 5 minutes or 6 minutes, and then you worked up to 10 minutes. And then you got a spot, which might be a 15 or 20-minute spot. It might take you months to get there, but you got a 20-minute spot. And then you worked in the early show, which was, let's say, an 8 o'clock show, and you did your 20-minute spot, and you might be first. And so, whereas the headliner was on last. So it's a kind of a hierarchy. And then when you got good in the, or confident in the early show, they then threw you into the late show where you got all the hens nights and the bucks nights. And you had to cut it through that. And a lot of women didn't do that for a long time, but I think if you wanted to keep going, and particularly if you wanted to be seen as equal to the men, even though that was never said, you were considered a bit of a pussy if you didn't do the late show. Because I felt anyway that there's no point restricting my audience. If I wanted to be a stand-up comedian and be able to work in any arena, then I had to do the late shows. And there was one night where I had a spot on the late show, and I was the only woman on the bill. There were 2 or 3 bucks. It was a room of about 100 people. There were 2 or 3 bucks nights, and they were pretty drunk and pretty revolting and yelling and screaming. And and I remember I got on stage. None of the men said anything. None of the male comedians said anything. They just said, "Have a good gig, break a leg." They didn't say, "Are you okay? Do you need help?" Nothing. They just said, "Okay, you're on, go backstage." And then when I got on stage, I noticed that each of the comedians, the MC, plus the comedians that were following me, had placed themselves strategically around the room, so that if anybody did really get nasty, they were there to sort of belt them. And it was such a beautiful gesture. Nobody said a word. The gig went well. I mean, I got heckled. I heckled back. They never said anything before or after. And many years later, I asked a couple of them, did they plan it? And they said, yes, they had. So I think that was very gracious and very kind. They knew that I needed to do it. So I'm going to be there just in case something happened. So I was very supportive. Certainly, I reckon right from 86 till about 2005, every female comedian was asked 2 questions. First of all, women aren't funny. What do you think makes you funny? And the other one was, what is it like to be a female comedian? To which I'd say, well, I don't know, because I'm not a male comedian, so I don't know what it's like to be a male comedian. I don't know what it's like to be a female comedian. But until I think, I mean, if somebody were to ask me that now, I'd probably just walk away. I don't think it's relevant. But yeah, there's still people who don't think women are funny. You still sometimes hear it in an audience. Oh, there's a chick coming on. She's not going to be funny. And you know that the woman on stage is going to blast them out of their seats. And so you just sit back and let it happen. But that's what I mean. And I think a lot of it, look, I've done a lot of reading and studying on this. And I think it is more often than not, dare I say, men of a certain age. And they're not used to seeing a woman in control on stage in what is basically was for many years a male domain. And we're not singing, we're not dancing, to go back to Feminism 101, we're not doing anything for the male gaze. We're just communicating. I'm not doing anything to be coquettish or sexy or anything like that. I'm talking and I'm being funny. And I think for some men of a certain age, they find that very difficult. I actually think that it would be, given the current state of things, and we won't go there, but in Canberra, I think it would be really good, it would be fantastic therapy to get some female comedians in Canberra and have them do gig after gig after gig, and every male politician sit through them again and again and try to heckle and see what happens. I think that's a very safe way of rejigging their brains.
Might be the only way they're going to listen.
Well, yeah. I think they would. Because it's very powerful.
Now, I know that, you've done a lot of writing, and which is how we first met. You've done a lot of workshops with women in media on how to use humour to help with other skills, whether it's public speaking or interviewing people or writing. Can you give us a brief overview of, how you think humour helps in those situations? What gift, what skills humour brings? I mean, you've touched on it there, facing down the enemy. But
we're not getting
confidence, I guess, confidence. But what else does humour help with in those?
There are different things that I do using humour, and it's come about because I was asked to do so many different kinds of gigs over the years that I've been working, and often they were in a more of a workshop role than kind of doing an actual stand-up comedy gig. So there are lots of ways it helps. But for example, the easiest thing for me, the first thing, and not easy, but the first thing to explain is this: we're all funny. And I find when I take a workshop, what often happens is people say, I'd love to learn how to be funny because I'm not funny. That to me is very sad, because everybody is funny. What happens, our ego gets in the way, and humour becomes a way of kind of competing, particularly amongst men, the way they banter with each other. Women don't banter quite in the same way, but, men use it as a kind of as a weapon. Which is why you don't see a lot of female political satirists. They're there, but you don't see them because they're perceived to be as extremely dangerous, unlike male satirists. But women satirists are perceived to be incredibly dangerous and potent. Somehow they're perceived to be evil, if horrible things. A male satirist is okay. I've experienced that a lot. But if you look at a child coming home from school, let's say I've occasionally parked near a school bus and the parents are all there picking up their children after a day of school, the kids will run out and they'll be full of stories. Mummy, we had this guy come to school and he had a funny hat on and then he fell over and he tripped, and when he fell and we could see his underpants. And in that sort of 30 seconds, that child has done a little stand-up comedy routine. Because there's a beginning, there's a middle, there's an end, they're creating a visual, there's a narrative, and they're excited by it. They haven't thought about what is going to be funny. It's funny, it made them laugh, they just speak. So we all have that. But we lose it because we become more sophisticated and people tell us that we don't have a sense of humour, or that one-liner is cringeworthy or whatever. And so we stop doing it, but we also stop being observant and we stop being interested in things. That's why we like being with little kids, because they're so curious. So what happens, where I think it helps in terms of writing and imagination, is because what I try and do is I can't tell anyone how to write funny. That's not what I do. What I try to do is help people find what's funny specifically about them, because we all have a unique sense of humour. That's why every comedian, the comedians that are around for a long time, people know what they're going to go and see when they go and see them, because they know they're going to be laconic, or they're going to talk about their marriage or their relationship or whatever. So there's a lens that every comedian puts their material through. And if you allow people to be in a safe place, such as a workshop, and what I do is I kind of forensically ask them questions to get a story out of them. And then we just muck around with the story while they're comfortable. And it can be a simple story. And slowly it becomes funny because all I do is I point out where it can be funny. I don't say this is necessarily funny, but it can. And then they see it. So for example, I will ask people to come in with who was their favorite character as a child. And it's interesting, the people over 40 realise that I mean their grandfather or their uncle. People in their 20s think it's a cartoon character or film character. which is something I've always noticed. But if I say to somebody, who is a favorite uncle or a grandparent or someone that you loved, maybe a woman down the road, and they'll describe, and then I say, well, what was different about her? And the more questions I ask, the more they find things that are unique, which then can be funny. So all I'm doing is just, I guess I'm just reacquainting people with their imagination and their curiosity. However, I've done a lot of work with survivors of domestic violence, and I've recently been doing workshops with people kind of in the mental health arena, and some work with survivors of sexual abuse. Because if you can help someone get agency over their narrative, they don't necessarily have to do a story or a routine about precisely what happened to them, but to have agency over a narrative where, I mean, all I do is guide them through how to tell the story, and then to get up on stage that very night. So we workshop all day, and then that night they tell the story. It's only 5 or 6, maybe 8 minutes max, to an audience which is laughing with you, not at you, is incredibly powerful. And I've researched this quite a lot, and the American Defense Forces are now using comedians with soldiers returning from Afghanistan with PTSD. Same reason. There's something that happens in your brain, the way the synapses connect when you laugh. I mean, now they can put an MRI on your brain and they can see exactly what happens. And it's almost as if, you know, things will go from the back of the brain to the front of the brain. But when you laugh, they kind of get diverted, and that's what physically actually makes you laugh. So it's to be able to give the skills, even little skills of stand-up comedy, and more importantly, the confidence to let someone who's never done it before get up and help them tell their story, a joke, whatever, has got profound implications. And, you know, they've now done heaps of research, and it really works. So I'm hoping to do a lot more of that.
That's fascinating. That's amazing. Yeah, that's real.
It is amazing, but they've now, the Americans have done a lot of research, and, you know, they wire people up and see that. Look, it is very powerful. I knew a comedian in London who was from America who had cerebral palsy, and she was hilarious, very brave. I mean, she would get up on stage and her hand would be shaking like this, you know, and she'd say, look, if you think this is bad, she would tell the audience she had cerebral palsy. She shook badly. She'd say, well, if you think this is bad, you should see what happens while I'm trying to put lipstick on, right? And the audience would be with her and they'd be laughing. So at some point, because I was in touch with her for a while, back in the States, they put her in a room with a whole, I think maybe 20 people with cerebral palsy, all who shook the same way. And they wired them up to see what would happen as they watched her. And one by one, as they were watching her, they all stopped shaking. So I think it's just the validation, but it's also the relaxed, the idea that it doesn't matter. She's shaking, I'm shaking. I don't know how it works, but it works.
That's very clever. Yeah. The other thing, you said that this is probably not related to your humor so much as you said that in your bio that you've recently learned how to stop feeling guilty. I don't know if that's storytelling jokes about it or what, but what is guilt something that women do more than men? Is that something we're born with? Is it an upbringing thing? And how did you get rid of it?
I think, you know, look, I did biblical studies for my HSC or whatever it's called, E12. And so a lot of my material comes from the Bible, oddly enough. It's a very, very funny book, Old Testament, not new. And I think the mythology of Eve having eaten that apple, you know, as I say, Eve came from Adam's ribcage, and I think that the cage still haunts us. I think that myth is very embedded in kind of in Western culture. And so guilt, I don't know if it's so much at Catholics, I won't that's a faux pas, because it is a Catholic kind of Judeo-Christian thing. You know, it's all to do with sin and eating the apple and doing the wrong thing. We're all going to be punished and we're going to go to hell. So, I mean, I've done a lot of humor about it, but I also think, you know, being the child of Holocaust survivors, it's not like the Jews own guilt. The Catholics are really good at guilt as well. But I think that there was a lot of guilt. The difference is that there's no confession in Judaism. there's no opportunity to say, I did this, I'm sorry. And if there was, they'd probably say, have 3 pieces of cheesecake and a cup of coffee and forget about it. There wouldn't be Hail Marys or anything like that. But I think I don't think it's necessarily a female thing, but I do think women carry, I see women around me, and I know myself, you will push until you can't push anymore and until you drop. I think women still need to learn a lot about taking care of themselves. They feel like they need to fulfill the role, they juggle a whole lot of things. It's very easy for people to say, self-care, but it's quite hard, I think, for women still to do that unless they're supported by families, by men around them.
Yeah.
And how I got rid of guilt, I just got old. There's a saying that women comics don't get older, they just get meaner. So I just got mad, and I thought, I don't have time to be guilty anymore. And it hasn't got me anywhere, really.
No, it's a total waste of space. It's a waste of energy.
Exactly.
Yeah.
What did I get?
Self-care, part of the reason that you ended up leaving bustling old St Kilda for 70 acres of wild bush in northern Tasmania. Is
why saying again? Say what was it? I didn't hear the beginning of the question.
Is self-care part of the reason why you went bush, why you left St Kilda for?
Look, I probably, but it was definitely, but it wasn't really front of mind. I think what I felt was that I had been, and I guess this in a way has a feminist kind of premise to it. I had been performing nonstop, really, other than a couple of breaks, probably for about 32 years. And I'm talking not really stopping at all, just going and going and going. And it was great, and I loved it. But then it got to a point where I actually felt that there wasn't anything else in my life. And like I was just describing, women, there is that imposter syndrome. You think you're never good enough. What are you aiming for? There were things that I wanted to do, like I wanted to do political satire on television, and I tried in all kinds of different ways. That never happened. I was heartbroken because you see groups of men continually doing it, but never a woman. You still don't see women just actually doing political satire, or just not necessarily doing material about being single or lonely or having children. When I used to say to schoolgirls, tell me one woman that on Australian television that just is herself and does all kinds of material, and they would say Ellen DeGeneres. I'd have to say, well, she's not Australian, she's American. So there were a whole lot of things that I tried to do, and I think in a way, because I didn't fit into that mold, producers couldn't see where to put me, and so I just kept working. I worked in England, I worked a lot, everywhere. And then I guess all of a sudden I realized that, like a lot of women do, that most of my relationships, particularly with my work, were all transactional, that I had become a commodity, and that I had fallen into the trap of all the things that I spoke about, but, the way we're represented in advertising, the way we think about the way we look, that in my lens, I had begun to see myself almost like a machine, not so much like a man, but like a machine. And it was a way of disassociating myself from any human feelings. I just kept working in this attempt to get good at what I was doing. And all of a sudden, I ended up having a holiday in Tasmania, and went to the bush and felt the wind and the cold and the rain and the sun, and thought, oh, these are real feelings. I'm not stuck in a green room at the basement of a huge theatre for 6 hours. And so I think, to put it mildly, I had no balance. So yeah, it is self-care. Mind you, now I'm working with chainsaws and digging holes in the ground. I don't, and avoiding snakes. So I don't know which is more dangerous, entertainment or living in the bush. But at least I can see the critters coming towards me in the bush. I think, yeah, there was a lot of striving, and I think a lot of women in my generation did strive. You had to.
Yeah. Yes.
Across the board, not just in entertainment.
Yeah.
In everything. And I think also what changed was that it took a while to get support of other women as well. And I think it's important to bring that up. I think I have found women becoming more and more supportive over the last 20 years than they might have been in the early 80s. And I'll never forget, I did you remember the 80s with the power shoulders, the really high shoulders. And I used to say this, mutton dressed as ram. All these women would, they would dress like men. You were encouraged to dress like a man. You wore pants, you had belts, you had these big shoulders, you wore ties. Or why? Why couldn't you be successful dressed, whatever? If you want to wear pearls, wear pearls. But it's not going to help your KPIs whether you wear pearls or not. It's how you perform. But I think in the 80s, there was a big movement of women that they were uber kind of male. Not so much, partly in the way they dressed and they performed, but also their attitudes began to be very dog eat dog. And I'll never forget that there's a woman called Della Sargent, who was a professor at Melbourne University. She'd written all kinds of books, and there was one of these, I don't know, it might have been about 1988, 89, was one of these women's lunches where everybody had the, bold red, bold blue, white, black power suits. And thankfully, I just had to do a comedy routine. But Dallas was speaking, and she basically had comfortable shoes, a skirt, and I think even a twin set. And she looked very out of place. And she waited until all these women, really successful women, were speaking, and nearly all, let's say 3 or 4 of them that were on this panel, and nearly all of them spoke about success and how you had to fight and you had to scratch your way to the top and the glass ceiling and how important, which sort of made sense. But the rhetoric was very kind of old school male, climb to the top, scratch, get big one. And there was nothing, none of them had said anything about other women. They were basically talking about themselves. And then Dallas got up and she, and everybody been clapping with him, and Dallas got up. I've never forgotten this, which is why I'm talking about it now. Dallas got up and she said that she was very disappointed to hear the tone of the other women speaking, that, so much had changed and yet so much hadn't. And she said, I didn't hear anything about helping other women. I didn't hear anything about in this arena about what you do when you get to the top. And she used the idea of a triangle of success. And she said, you've all described success as this kind of peak at the top of a mountain, and you've climbed and scratched your way to the top. Or when you get to the top, there isn't a lot of room and you've got to maintain that position. And she said, and this is her idea or her metaphor, she said, I would suggest that success is an upturn triangle. So at the bottom, it's very, very hard to get a grip and hard to get your bearings, but that when you get to the top, it's a big wide platform. So when you get to the top, there's a lot of room, and it's the responsibility of the women at the top to throw ropes to the women at the bottom. And that was the first time I'd heard a woman actually say, get your act together, and if you're doing really well or you've made it somewhere, you must help other women. I think that has changed. That has changed profoundly in the last 15, 20 years. Yeah. That has changed more than things have changed generally.
Yeah, I'd agree. Yeah, I'd say that it used to be the idea that there was only room for one. There was one spoken woman, and if that was you, there was no room for anybody else.
That's right.
Now that there's, we're getting closer to the idea, at least, of 50-50.
Exactly.
Question in the box has come from Emma Horton.
Emma Horton, yes.
Yes. So lovely to see you both. There has been some public debate about how difficult it is for women to remain employed in their 50s and 60s and beyond. And I don't know why Emma would be asking us in particular this question. I can't imagine, because it obviously doesn't affect us.
Exactly.
But
why
she says,
yes.
As two people with great careers, apparently, can you reflect on that and project some optimism? It's hard. It's a hard question after a year of COVID and not a lot of work, especially in the performing arts. But can you reflect on? It is a hard question,
especially now. And look, I think, and it's a question I've been thinking about a lot lately, because let's face it, stand-up comedy it's in this country a young person's game. Because there isn't, it's not just about women, there just isn't a very big marketplace. And so mostly my career was based on working live. And really, I never did a lot of television. One, because my material was often too political and nobody wanted to take the risk. But also I just worked live. So I got people liking my work because I did every university and every little venue that was around. And you get tired of doing that. You get tired, and it doesn't really grow you creatively. So I think it depends on what work it is that you do. there are some things you can go on doing until you're ready to stop. But I think particularly now with COVID and work being reduced, and even now, I mean, I know the Melbourne Comedy Festival is going to be happening, but there'll probably be social distancing, which means numbers will be less and they'll be using certain venues and not others. But for me, I have begun to redirect my energies using everything that I've done. I'm still performing, but not as much. Not because I don't enjoy it, but because I think it's not moving me forward creatively. At this point, I want to be able to give back. I mean, it sounds really woo-woo, but by doing the work with survivors of domestic violence or sexual abuse using stand-up, it's my way of being able to use the skills that I've gleaned to actually perhaps make a shift with some people. So I think for most people in their 50s and 60s, that you kind of find your own way of how to gather everything you've done and perhaps just sort of, I mean, there's a term that's being used during the refit. I think that's the word they use, just to refit into something else. That's
pivot.
Yeah, I think that's how I'm working anyway. But, if you're a professor, if you're an academic or a physician, or, you don't have to stop until you want to stop.
Mm.
But there's only so many years I can get into a pair of stilettos, seriously.
Well, it's good to hear that you're coming over to Melbourne for the comedy festival.
Yes.
And I'm guessing that you've got some dates on a website.
There's only one date, and I'm doing, I put it on Facebook, there's only one date. I'm doing 17th of April, but Monica Dullard, who's a fabulous colleague and who's been working not quite for as long as I have, but what she's done, and it's a fabulous idea given COVID, she's doing an old school stand-up comedy night. So she's got a pub in, and I should have it in front of me, but I don't, but people go to my Facebook page, it'll be there. It's a pub in Carlton, and she's doing 5 nights, and every night she's got a different guest. So Fiona O'Loughlin's doing it, Sammy Shah, Dave O'Neill, Damien Callum, and I think, and me. And we're each doing one night with Monica emceeing and doing a spot every night. So it's in a pub, you can have a meal. I think they're only allowing 70 or 80 people, not even. So it's going to be like old school, pub comedy gig with good food and
Excellent.
good craft artisanal beer, whatever that is.
I wonder what you were going to say then. I was thinking of this craft corner and everyone's sitting there knitting while they're listening to you talk.
Well, they can if they want to. They can. But I wouldn't like the distraction. I'm very noise phobic. The clacking of knitting needles would get to me. Yeah. Thank you for the question, Emma. Good question.
It is. Again, I'm not sure why she asked us about people and older women.
No idea.
I'm stuck for the last question. I was going to either ask you, has the serenity of living in the bush, the Tasmanian wilderness, has that helped your writing? But then as a second question, how OCD do you need to be to create a really good woodpile?
Look, you don't have to be OCD to create a really good woodpile. I happen to be OCD, and I also love the way wood piles can be structured. I mean, Tasmanians do the most amazing wood piles. They
it's an art,
make
right? It's an art.
Pardon?
It's an art, right?
It's absolutely an art. It's absolutely an art. But also the whole point is that the wood has to dry. I mean, you leave it outside so it's seasoned. So there's no point making, I've got into the habit of putting them into the V of 2 branches, but then it doesn't dry properly. So I'm a bit OCD about it, but it's also got to be there for a year or more, the wood pile, because it's got a season and it takes that long to dry. So I like to make them look like sculptures. Yeah, I enjoy it. But then I said, I don't really have a life now. As far as my writing, in between cutting up the wood, stacking the wood, and then carrying the wood, I'm not doing a lot of writing because I'm too busy playing with wood. Living in the bush, you're the total slave of the trees. You're always in the understory. You're clearing up the branches they've dropped. You're cleaning up the leaves. You're making room so you can walk through. It's like the trees just dump everything, and you're the one that runs around and pick it up so there won't be fire. But I think as far as writing, I'm probably I have written while I've been here, and I've written about what is happening around me, because it's certainly for me, it's a very novel experience. not being in control, and I have no control of the bush whatsoever. I'm also absolutely gobsmacked by all the different creatures and the things that they do. So that's interesting. So I'm probably going to write more about that. Just, you know, urban woman, and I'm not the first. The urban woman goes to live in the bush. It's a really steep learning curve.
Sounds wonderful. I hope you turn it into
Thank
a book,
you.
or even better, a play.
A play.
Yes, maybe with some interpretive dance.
Yeah, and with chainsaws.
With chainsaws.
So I could ask Havana or Still to sponsor it. That's what I could do. Yeah, I think a book would be good. I don't know. I feel like a book would be good. But yeah, I feel very lucky to be here. But it is a lot of hard work for anybody thinking doing it. It's a lot of hard work, but worth it.
Excellent. Well, does anybody else have any more questions? Anybody else out there? If not, we might close for the evening. Sue Bell, would you like to say hello?
Hello. And I've got to draw the raffle.
Wonderful.
Yeah, so I will do that. Can you see me in the...
Yes.
Yeah.
Great, because I've turned myself off so I can't see myself. So what I'm trying to do is...
Thank you, Jackie.
Yeah, here we go.
While you're drawing your numbers, just a big thank you to Rachel for being such a sport. And
you're very welcome. I hope that some of it was interesting. Thank you. No, thank you.
And thanks for doing all the tech support.
Okay, yeah, no, I think a few people had problems getting on, unfortunately, because they didn't see the Zoom link on the ticket. It didn't, yeah. So some people popped on YouTube to watch it because I was streaming.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah. So that's good. So people got to watch it. All right. So this is the prize for those of you who entered the raffle ticket. I've gone into darkness here, but anyway, it's a $50 voucher.
It's reversed. I wouldn't worry.
It's upside down.
There we go. A $50 voucher from Delamere Vineyard. So that will get it sent out to somebody, and it is my favourite winery. So we will enjoy all that. All right. So here's my Bunnings hat that I've got all the raffle tickets in. So I'll just give them a little. Thank you, everyone, for buying.
Very professional, Sue. I love it.
Okay, here we go. So it is C07, red C07. Someone called Anna Marulli.
Anna Marulli.
Oh, you know her?
Good on her.
Yes.
Yes, you do.
Oh, that was not rigged at all. I don't know who she is. Who is she?
Yeah.
Anna used to work at the Weekly Review and The Age.
Oh, okay. Right. Well, she is the lucky recipient of
good for her.
That prize. So
she'll enjoy that too.
Yeah. So is there any more questions from anyone before we finish up?
Thank you, everyone, for coming on board, and happy International Women's Day, or I don't know, what do you say? Let's move forward.
Cake Day.
Let's hope there's some change over the next few weeks, especially.
Oh, God, yes.
And thank you, Jane, for doing the interview.
Yes, thank you, Jane, for all the questions and being patient. Thank you. And to Sue, thank you for the tech support.
Yeah, no problem at all.
Absolute pleasure.
All right. Well,
is that it? Are we going?
Yeah. Well, the only other thing is that we're hoping to have. I know this won't be any use to anybody in Tasmania unless you want to come across the ditch. But the Women in Media Victoria, are hoping to have the Jill Singer lecture, which we started 2 years ago and then had to cancel last year. But we're hoping to resurrect it this year and make it an annual event in May. So watch the Facebook, watch this space. And we hope we've got a very exciting speaker to announce soon.
Fantastic.
I went to it the other year. It was great. Louise Milligan. Really worthwhile going.
All right. Good night, everybody.
Good night, everybody. Have a lovely night.
Thank you.
Good night. Bye.
Good night. I shall just stop the stream. There we go.